welcome everybody to the Freedom Hub Working Group. At this current edition is another exciting one. Definitely want you to come back in the future. So if you're not already registered, please take advantage of this link and go ahead and register to do so. Also, all of these are consistently recorded and you'll see them on any of these popular channels. And do remember you're being sponsored here by your Freedom Hub. There's our sponsor. And then also these are some of the key channels, and you'll see there's a wealth of videos on here to share and to view that you may have missed in the past. So we're going to definitely want you to take advantage of that. And then also we do maintain a presence on LinkedIn. So if you'd like to participate over there as well. Way up. Okay. Charles, if you kind of.
Sure, Jeff, and welcome, Patrick. It's really exciting to have today's topic because anyone who goes deep into libertarianism comes across Rothbard. And what really pisses me off, and excuse my French, Jeff, is that so many deep libertarian thinkers praise Hayek and Mises, but some of them just have some internecine disease which makes them hate Rothbard. And I don't get it, because clearly he is the #1 best thinker, political economist of the past century. No question about it. He makes Mises more understandable. He's more clear than Hayek. He applies Austrian economics to history and revises it. Political philosophy, he gets a bit complex there, and that's not my boat. But his history is great. And he takes sort of a Nockian class consciousness there with the crony elite screwing the regular Joe, through all their government tools. And Conceived in Liberty is one of his great classics on our founding. There's, I think, 4 volumes, and someone found his fifth volume. And it was all in scribble. And I guess this one Mises grad school intern or fellow, Patrick Newman, could translate his scribble and published the final volume. And it gets to the conclusion of our founding, the Constitution. And I gather it kind of takes Albert J. Nock's conclusion that it was somewhat of a coup d'etat by the powerful and screwing over the Articles of Confederation apparatus. As weak as it was, did they have to wholesale replace it with a system that has given us what we have now, this really complex deep state. So I'm excited to hear what Patrick has to say. He's an econ assistant professor at Florida Southern College, and I'm excited to hear this, Jeff.
Me too, especially after that build-up. Now you have a lot to live up to there, Patrick.
There we go. Okay, beautiful. So thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you for the nice build-up. I am Patrick Newman, so I'm assistant professor at Florida Southern College, and I also have the privilege of editing the long-lost 5th volume of Murray Rothbard's Conceived in Liberty, a notable Austro-libertarian thinker, and that's what I'll be talking about today. I'll go through a little bit about the history of the project, as well as the actual book itself and why it's important for today, particularly regarding its sort of insights on the U.S. Constitution, which has a lot of play still today regarding arguments, even of something like healthcare. Oh, is this constitutional, or is the government, the Constitution, a limited government, or does it promote big government, et cetera? So we'll go through that. And I guess I hope this presentation's good. If it's not, I can blame it on the coronavirus, and we'll leave it at that. So anyway, what's the presentation about, and why should I care? So as I mentioned, I'm going to go through a brief history of the Conceived in Liberty series, and then I'm going to go through the overview of the 5th volume, around 300 pages. This volume is, you can find it online. You can buy it on Amazon. You can buy a Kindle version of it. There's a free PDF online. It was released by the Mises Institute last October. And it goes through, we'll be talking about some of the things that it goes through, such as the Articles of Confederation, the Constitutional Convention, and the ratification debates. So, and also through the significance of the U.S. Constitution, which I alluded to, And particularly, was it ratified voluntarily? Was this a voluntary government? And is the Constitution libertarian? So is the Constitution a libertarian document that promotes a limited government? Or was it actually intended to be something much different? And if so, then how did it get its sort of libertarian background, or where did it get the libertarian tradition from, so to speak? So anyway, we'll be touching on all of that. To provide a little hint, the libertarian emphasis of the Constitution came from the actual opponents of the Constitution, the anti-federalists, who strategically later interpreted it in a libertarian fashion. But that's something Rothbard talks about at the end, and we'll get there, get to that later. But anyway, just to go through this, yes, another Rothbard book. He died in 1995, but he has been continually sort of publishing after his death. He has more publications after death than Tupac, sometimes as I've phrased it. And you have this Conceived in Liberty series, and the 4 volumes, they were written in the 60s, which we'll talk about. The 4 original volumes were published in the 1970s, and then you can clearly see the 5th volume I wanted to time it nicely. It came out 40 years after the 4th volume came out. So never say never. Everything will eventually get out of development hell in due time. But anyway, to sort of go through briefly the history of Rothbard's History of the United States, because the question becomes, okay, if you're publishing a book that was supposed to come out 40 years ago and it was written even longer before then, why are you publishing it now, and why did it take so long to get published? What makes me so special, I guess, or someone who had the enough free time to do it. In the 1950s, Rothbard worked on Man, Economy, and State in America's Great Depression. So this was these were 2 books very prominent in the Austrian tradition, or the Austrian School of Economics. The first one was sort of a general tome on economic theory, and the second one was a historical analysis on the Great Depression. Afterwards, so those books came out in 1962 and 1963, respectively. And in the 1960s, Rothbard then started to work on an American history project. He had a research grant in the mid-60s to sort of work on either 2 or 3 volumes in 3 phases. It was supposed to be all the way up until the present back then, which was 1960. The first phase on early American history, which later just became the 5-volume Conceived in Liberty series, was supposed to take about 1.5 years. Phase 2 would take 2 years, and then phase 3 would take 1.5 years again. That's sort of breaking down the 5-year research grant. That was at least the plan. Sort of a habit of Rothbard was his projects got longer and longer. Man, Economy, and State was originally supposed to be a textbook version of Human Action. Instead, it became its own 3-volume sort of sprawling book. And anyway, so I gotta just at least see my quote here. This is something I find very important. This was in a memo before he started writing on why a libertarian American history book was needed. His book was supposed to be from a libertarian perspective. I find it important because it's still true. What Rothbard says is still true, and even more, I think it's even more applicable today. One thing Rothbard spoke about was that there's tons of books from the liberal perspective or from the conservative perspective, but there's still no overarching book from, say, a libertarian perspective. And then Rothbard goes through this. He says there's perhaps no greater single influence in forming the American mind than its view of American history. Well, economics, for example, is almost completely confined to specialists and to a narrow market at best. Works on history, and especially history of the United States, have a far wider and broader market. The student and adult American are then shaped, 1, by the textbooks used in the scholastic courses, and 2, general interpretive works on American history read by adult laymen and by professional historians as well. So I find this quote very important because what he's basically saying is that if you want to convince people, I apologize, that was my dog. He's clearly not interested in the talk. What he's saying is if you want to convince people, you got to go through a history book. You got to try and provide empirical examples. Most people know more about history than about economic theory, and they learn about history in high school and college, etc. And that's how they generally shape their worldview. So most people have a bad view of capitalism because they have a bad view of the Industrial Revolution and American history and etc. and so on. Anyway, to continue on, at the end of 1966, for a variety of reasons, Rothbard only completed phase 1. He had typed drafts of volumes 1 to 4, and then a handwritten draft of volume 5. The general format that he would do this is just I guess provide a little bit of perspective. This is in the 60s. There's obviously no computers, and he would handwrite his works, and then, at least for this, dictate them to a recording machine. And then initially, his wife would actually type them up so he could edit them. And then later on, a professional typist was sort of involved. But there were obviously delays in doing that. Computers, keyboards were not nearly as fast as they are now. So that took time. Rothbard also wanted to devote more time to phase 1. So he ended up spending, instead of 1.5 years, he spent 5 years on phase 1. He wanted to start phase 2, but he had to stop. His research grant ran out, and then he got his first full-time professor faculty job at Brooklyn Polytechnic, and that's where he spent most of his career until he went to UNLV, in Nevada. And anyway, so in the early 1970s, he was sort of alluding to this project. In an interview, he said, "I've written up to the Constitution. It will be a history of the United States from a libertarian point of view." It's very difficult to write that because the thing is, we don't know what has happened. A lot of the facts have been buried. Orthodox histories don't give many facts. A lot of facts are just left out. The manuscript could be used as a textbook, I hope. Man, Economy, and State was originally supposed to be a textbook and wound up as a giant treatise. I think this might be the same thing. So sort of going through this history, he's saying, all right, I have this mass, this 5-volume mass, and literally, you could say like 2,000 pages of material. They weren't published yet. He then published the 4 volumes with Arlington House, the volumes that were typed up. And by the time he finally got to volume 5, he had already written it in the 60s, but when he got back to it, the discs, the recording machine was basically ruined. So the discs used in the recording machine, they were ruined. And all that was left was basically 60 pages of a typed manuscript and about 500 pages of a handwritten manuscript. So in an interview in 1991, Rothbard said, volume 5 on the Constitution, it was written in longhand and no one can read my handwriting. So basically, this was sort of the main reason why it never got published is that, well, it got delayed. Arlington House went out of business. And then you have this volume 5, it's sort of this handwritten stack of pages, and Rothbard got busy with other projects. And you could say, okay, well, that might not be too much of an insurmountable barrier. Surely someone can read his handwriting. Well, these are some pictures of his handwriting, and you can tell that it's sort of very sprawling. It looks like something from the Revolutionary War. And it's got things marked out. It's got X's. It basically no one wanted to tackle reading this. And so I sat down and I learned Rothbardian, so to speak. I learned his language. I did this over the summer of 2017, and then I continued to edit the book in 2018. I edited this in 2018 and then continued to edit it in 2019. So I learned how to read his language in 2018, and it took a long time. I won't lie, it was annoying to talk about it politely. It was really interesting, it was fascinating, it was really enjoyable, but it was tough work. Just sort of, you can tell looking at some of these words, it took a long time to sort of figure out what he was saying. You got to go back and all of that and adjust and anyway. So enough about the sort of history of the book. What exactly is the book about and why should you care? All right, so there's this 5th volume on Conceived in Liberty, the 5th volume of Conceived in Liberty, it's finally out. Why should someone read a book that's 40 years old and, written in the 1960s? Well, the answer to that is that it's really about a time period that doesn't really get discussed so much in traditional American histories. It sort of gets rushed over. This is the 1780s, after the American Revolutionary War and before the presidency of George Washington, when you sort of speed through everything fairly quickly, and then you basically, okay, well, you had this problem, the articles weren't working, and then this Constitution, all these public interested founding fathers, and they pushed this thing, and then, okay, here we are, off to the races. You got Hamilton and Jefferson and all that stuff. And instead, the picture Rothbard tries to present is very different. In fact, it was really more of a coup, as we'll sort of go through. And it was much more of a special interest constitution than sort of this constitution in the broad public interest. And many historians, political scientists will be more honest, and they'll say, yeah, it was a coup, but they say, oh, it was in the public interest. The founding fathers, they were public interested, and the Constitution was big government, and big government obviously helps everyone, so therefore, everything's good, everything's hunky-dory, etc. But in reality, it was different. So these are the 6 parts of the book. In the first 2 parts, Rothbard sort of goes through the economics of the Articles of Confederation. And then the remaining 3 parts, he talks about the entire process in build up to the Constitution, which was ratified in 1788, and the new government began in early 1789, and so on. Anyway, the year was 1784. It was the end of the Revolutionary War, and you had the centralizing Articles of Confederation enacted in 1781 to bring the 13 separate states together. This failed power drive by this financier, Robert Morris, who was the, you could say, the intellectual father or the mentor of Alexander Hamilton. And then you have this Treaty of Paris that's between Great Britain and the United States, formalizes independence. Rothbard talks about all of this stuff right here in his volume 4. So anyway, one thing I also just want to mention, just as a side note, is sort of related to some of the conversation that we were having earlier. The one thing is, a lot of this time, and it did actually happen quite prominently in several cities during the 1780s and early 1790s, they would have some sort of disease outbreak. It wasn't the coronavirus, but it would be far worse, where you'd have to sometimes clear the city. Even during the nation's founding, we had to do that. So remember, it's never as bad as it was back in the day. So I guess we'll always keep that in perspective. But anyway, sort of return to our topic here. The Confederation Congress and the state governments have a huge wartime debt, and this was because they chose to fight the American Revolutionary War through an expensive standing army, not through sort of decentralized guerrilla warfare. And they didn't want to raise taxes, so instead they just printed money, and they borrowed money. And the printed money also, much of it became debt. And the issue about this is, so it was paid to soldiers, it was paid to merchants, etc. But what they did is they sold it in distress to sort of wealthy speculators who sort of bought up these junk bonds, and then they were hoping that the Confederation Congress would fund these bonds, acquire a taxing power, which they did not currently have, and then they would basically make a killing from this. This is an unrecognized aspect of government cronyism people don't often always concentrate on, which is that you'd have some sort of interest would buy junk bonds, and then they would basically get the government to turn those junk bonds into AAA bonds, and so you make a lot of money by doing that. But anyway, this debt was literally, it sort of hung over the nation like the sword of Damocles. And Rothbard's solution was that, well, you should have divided the federal debt up amongst the states, and they should have been able to default and repudiate how they chose. Virginia was, in fact, defaulting on its debt. It was downsizing its debt. Other states, such as Massachusetts, were choosing not to, and instead funding their debt through very regressive high taxes, which we'll talk about provoked tax rebellion. Some states were defaulting on their debt by basically printing money, and others were raising taxes, etc. And those sort of solutions aggravated the wartime economy, or the post-war economy. The economy was sort of ravaged from hyperinflation, military confiscation of goods, British pillaging of the infrastructure and supplies, sort of flight of loyalists in their capital. And, after the war, the U.S. also had to adjust to new trading realities. Great Britain was not allowing exports from the United States, and there was or at least restricting exports, and there was a brief credit expansion boom bust from some of the banks in the country. So anyway, you had this depression, and a lot of people say that, it was this reason we needed this the larger government. The Articles of Confederation were too weak to handle it. In reality, part of it was inevitable, and then it was aggravated by basically big government policies, particularly funding the debt, etc. Having a stronger government from the get-go wouldn't really have been able to change anything. The economy basically started to recover before we had the Constitution, but that doesn't stop most historians. Anyway, so this depression was aggravated by states printing money and raising taxes to pay off their debts. Shays' Rebellion, the famous Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, was a tax revolt of basically these poor Western farmers upset at the high taxes they were having to pay. Quite interestingly and significantly, states also erected interstate tariffs and navigation acts, but interstate competition made them ineffective. If one state chose to raise high tariffs against British imports, then another state could have lower tariffs to try and capture more of the market. And there was the movement for federal tariffs and navigation acts failed. This is because you needed unanimity. All 13 states had to agree, and there was always a couple holdouts that basically decided they didn't want to agree. And this is sort of a very libertarian provision, unanimity requirement. The economy wasn't as bad as contemporaries argued. The contemporaries that were usually arguing for the bad economy were usually those in support of a stronger central government. And the Confederation Congress was about to throw in the towel on the debt. Lo and behold comes the U.S. Constitution, or these nationalist forces, these groups that were supporting a strong national government instead of a confederation, a decentralized government. We had separate entities sort of come together, and they had autonomy and independence, etc. And you first had speculative creditors who wanted to pay off the debt. You had ex-army officers. They wanted to have a strong standing army. You wanted merchants and manufacturers with centralizing regulations. You wanted land speculators to prevent Western secession. Southerners wanted the Spanish Mississippi River and to protect slavery. Land speculators in the British Northwest and commercial farmers wanted a strong foreign policy to prod open foreign markets. Anyway, these were the very special interests, and they all got together because they said, all right, we're going to get together and we're all going to benefit at the expense of course, the poor farmer and the average consumer. So get a bunch of special interests together, and they all just tried to sock the hapless group that can't organize themselves politically with the bill, which is how things usually go. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton go to work. James Madison is sometimes often portrayed as a proponent of small government. In reality, he's actually just a total apologist for big government. He only sort of sided with Thomas Jefferson sort of for opportunistic reasons in the 1790s. And anyway, both of them, they organized for an all-state convention to legally revise the Articles of Confederation, which means that the government must be approved by the Confederation Congress and then the state legislatures unanimously. This was this famous Philadelphia Convention in the summer of 1787, dominated by the nationalist group. So many prominent anti-federalists or proponents of smaller government, which we'll talk about, such as Patrick Henry of Virginia, the famous "Give me liberty or give me death," or George Clinton of New York, no relation with the Clinton family, though that would be kind of funny. But they were not present at this convention. So anyway, the result, and Rothbard spends a great deal talking about this constitutional convention. In Rothbard, this is a quote, sort of a large block quote from Rothbard. He says, "The Constitution was unquestionably a high nationalist document. Congressional selection of the president was changed to chosen by popular election. Admission of the states was made purely arbitrary, and the amendment power was transferred from the states to Congress. Loopholes existed in the enumerated list, the national supremacy clause, the dominance of the federal judiciary, the virtually unlimited power to tax, raise armies and navies, make war and regulate commerce, the the necessary and proper clause, and the powerful general welfare loophole all allowed the virtually absolute supremacy of the central government." Something just to pause here before continuing, this is an important point Rothbard mentions, is that these vague clauses, so to speak, necessary and proper, general welfare, national supremacy, etc., those were intended to be vague and powerful. So the general welfare clause was sort of meant to be an escape hatch. The Federalists, the Nationalists, did not want to enumerate the Constitution with powers, because then that could restrict what the government could do. They wanted to create a very powerful government. This is what they always wanted to do since the days of the Articles of Confederation and even before. Anyway, and so this is Rothbard continuing. He says, while no libertarian restraints were placed on state powers, no Bill of Rights existed to check the federal government. And slavery was cemented into American society by the nationalist 20-year guarantee of the slave trade in the 3/5 clause representing slaves in Congress and in the compulsory fugitive slave clause. The Northern Nationalists were willing, if shamefacedly, to agree in exchange for the right to regulate commerce and thus grant themselves commercial privileges, while the Southern Nationalists were willing to concede regulation of commerce in confident expectation of an early slave state preponderance in Congress for the South and Southwest. This is something that doesn't always get emphasized so much, but that slavery was very entrenched in the Constitution. That was a big motivation to basically protect slavery, to have a strong fugitive slave clause, to subsidize the South through 3/5 clause, the 3/5 representation, as well as some other privileges regarding continuing the slave trade for 20 years and so on. And this was all sort of part of the bargain. And basically the North said, all right, we got to enact our tariffs, you got to keep your slaves. And this eventually early hints of the Civil War later on in the future. Though this isn't to say that the South was dominated solely by slavery. That was certainly not the case. But anyway, continuing on with the ratification debate, sort of moving on, the Nationalists have this new document. Now they got to convince the public to ratify it. The Constitution, they basically decided that they would ratify it illegally. They said the current government, the Confederation Congress, did not have to approve the document, and the U.S. Constitution was sent to special ratifying conventions rather than the state legislatures for the intended purpose of basically they knew that the state legislatures would not pass it. And only 9 states, not 13 states, were needed. You have two groups, the Federalists, who are really the Nationalists, versus the anti-Federalists, who are really the Federalists. When we think of a federal government, we think, we all remember from our high school education, we say, oh, you've got the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches, and well, they all sort of provide these beautiful checks and balances and everything. That actually was sort of an apologist for to supplant the real federalism, which is you had a government, this equal share of power, roughly similar share of power between the states and the national government. So the anti-federalists who wanted a confederation, they were really the Federalists. The Federalists, on the other hand, were the Nationalists. But the Nationalists sort of seized the advantage and they started calling themselves the Federalists. And instead, the anti-Federalists, the Federalists are called the anti-Federalists. And no one likes to be an anti-something. It just sounds bad. So again, this is sort of propaganda at work. And the ratification debates also sort of show that it wasn't really the social contract theory, the voluntary theory of state formation versus the conquest theory. It was more of a coercive theory. This wasn't ratified unanimously. In fact, in many states that it was sort of very close. We'll talk about, and in fact, it really shouldn't have been ratified. But this idea that it was sort of a social contract is not true. Federalists had the advantage from superior leadership, newspaper propaganda, malapportionment of delegates at the convention. So the anti-federal, the Western populations were underrepresented intentionally. Anti-federalist delegates were bribed. You had these restrictive amendments. The Federalists promised these restrictive amendments after ratification, which of course is a completely empty promise. It's akin to saying, all right, give us your guns now, and then we'll decide what to do, how to distribute the guns after the fact, which makes no sense whatsoever. Some parts of states, such as New York City, Federalist New York City, threatened to secede from heavily anti-federal upstate New York. And there are even threats of hostile retaliatory trade legislation, particularly against Rhode Island, which was the last state to enter in. The new government was contemplating basically just blockading Rhode Island. Massachusetts, New York, and Virginia were the toughest large anti-federalist states. The convention was all the debates were all very close there, the votes extremely close, and there was definitely some chicanery going on there, as Rothbard talks about. The Constitution was finally ratified in the summer of 1788. New Hampshire was the 9th state. Virginia and New York followed shortly thereafter. In North Carolina and Rhode Island were basically ratified in late 1789 and in mid-1790. The Anti-Federalists were very upset. They wanted their promised restrictive amendments and even a second constitutional convention. Though in the House of Representatives, so in the new Congress, James Madison strategically pushes for a Bill of Rights to sort of thwart these movements. These Bill of Rights are sort of, we all know and love, they're mostly personal liberty amendments, though. And there's really just a weak structural amendment, particularly the 10th Amendment. But they weren't what the Anti-Federalists wanted, such as absolute restrictions on taxation, standing armies, regulation of commerce, things like term limits or representation, et cetera, that would have severely changed the actual government. And to show how weak the Bill of Rights was, they were basically disregarded by contemporaries, such as the Federalists with their the Alien and Sedition Acts, and the Embargo Act by the Republicans in the Jefferson administration. But anyway, so we've got that. Here's the real significance, is that the Constitution was sort of realized to be a big government document, but the Anti-Federalists, in order to stay relevant, sort of interpreted the Constitution strictly. The Federalists lied during the ratification debates, and they said the Constitution is limited. The Anti-Federalists said, well, we now got to argue their lie, basically, and say that it's a limited government document. Jefferson and Madison, who both supported the Constitution, did this, but for their own reasons. And then you get into this seamless sort of in the 1790s, you had the Hamiltonian Federalists versus the Republican Party, which is really formed of former anti-federalists and disgruntled federalists led by Jefferson and Madison. But the point is that when we actually get this sort of strict interpretation of the Constitution, this is something Rothbard mentions at the end of the book, is that this really came from the anti-federalists. It wasn't intended by the Federalists. In that, so sort of, I think you think of someone like a Ron Paul, he's really carrying on the anti-federalist legacy, so to speak. But anyway, in conclusion, Rothbard provides a unique and radical interpretation of American history. Understanding the true motivation behind the Constitution is important for sort of understanding American history, and you should read the book. It's out. It's, I guess, I feel like a good capitalist. I have this here, and you've got the book right here. And like even a better capitalist, I have the 4-volume, the original 4-volume Conceiving Liberty. So if you just want to practice, lifting weights, or you need a weapon to sort of strike someone down with, one of your liberal friends or something, you have this. Or if someone tries to shoot you, it's literally impenetrable. But now we finally have let me do it like this, the 5-volume Conceived in Liberty series. So that's my little pitch for Rothbard's book. And thank you so much for listening. And I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Well, that was very good, Patrick. And boy, with spring coming up, that looks like some great poolside reading you've got there for us. So,
exactly.
must have knocked that out in a weekend there at the pool.
Yeah.
You know, what's been happening though? Has there been any kind of interesting traction or anything as a consequence of this book now coming out? What's been the political and public reaction?
So I've been on a bunch of podcasts for the book. It has been reviewed favorably on Amazon, and those kind of trickle in. I know there's been very good sales of the book. I think there's going to be a review of it coming out in Reason by Jeff Hummel in the near future, and I know a couple other reviews. Unfortunately, President Donald Trump has not tweeted about the book yet, though I'm sure he will any moment now. And I actually was very interesting as I was working on the book. I don't know if anyone here has heard of Gordon Wood. He's sort of well known in the Good Will Hunting movie. But anyway, his dissertation advisor, Bernard Bailyn, who wrote a book on the American Revolution, Rothbard was very enthusiastic about. He was a professor at Harvard, etc. He was actually supposed to read the fifth volume of Conceived in Liberty in the 1960s. That was part of the research grant. And anyway, for obvious reasons, he never finished it. He's still alive, at least like last year he was, and he's in his late 90s. And I emailed him about it, saying I had the letter from the 60s, and I sent him a copy of the book. And I was like, hey, just want to let you know, I finally did this. And it was pretty funny because 20 minutes after I sent the email, he got back to me. He's like, oh, thanks for sending this. I remember this project. And I was like, okay, either he's really excited or he has a lot of free time on his hands. But so anyway, that's kind of the current sort of press, I guess, about the book. I know it's been well received. It obviously has not made the news waves, but I hope it will. Maybe sometime in the future. But
I'll give it a little time to be out there and fester, so that's good. Charles, I see you got your hand up.
Thanks, Jeff, and fantastic summary, Professor Newman. What to what do you attribute the curious denigration a lot of libertarians impose on Rothbard? In other words, weirdly not giving him his due, number one. And what would you think? This is a broader question. Rothbard would be focusing on now if he were still alive.
So that's a good question. Yeah, so Rothbard's life during his many years in the Libertarian movement and in various sorts of other political alliances, there were many sort of notable falling outs, particularly among him and the Koch brothers. He used to be close with Charles Koch, and in the late 70s, he was a founding member of Cato, and a lot of basically bad blood and splits like that. So I agree with you that, I know when you mentioned this at the beginning, it's definitely a reason why he is not more properly appreciated, I would say. While other guys like Mises and Hayek in the Austrian school would get more appreciation, or even someone like a Milton Friedman, famous Chicago school libertarian, etc. It largely has to do, I think, with personal splits, as well as the fact that Rothbard was always much more uncompromising in his work. It was much clearer to see his positions. So someone like a Hayek, who really supported a large degree of interventions, is sort of like a cottage industry of figuring out what Hayek meant. You don't really have that problem with Rothbard. What he'd be working on now, that would certainly be an interesting question. I know that he had many other projects he wanted to finish, aside from, say, this book or the Progressive Era, which I edited. He was working on a multi-volume history of economic thought. He never wrote his third volume. I imagine he would be continuing on current events. He probably would be writing definitely about the financial crisis and all of that. I think he would have continued working on his American history. He might have revised Man, Economy, and State. I know he wanted to. But there would be a lot of projects. I think one thing that a lot of people agreed about, and which has made his death so sudden and tragic, is that he wouldn't really have been one to retire. So a lot of, he would have been in his almost 90, I want to say. And he would have continued. He obviously would have slowed down, but some academics, they might just retire once they're in their 70s and their 60s and just kind of tune it out. But Rothbard probably would have continued to go in some sense. I certainly imagine he would have heavily supported Ron Paul in his 2 presidential bids in 2008 and 2012.
Very good perspective. So based on all the stuff you've spent kind of understanding the Constitution and its origins and so on, where do you kind of think we're going to be headed over time?
Well, I personally think socialism's coming in the future. I'm not looking forward to it. I hope it comes after I get tenure. I think the Constitution, it's kind of a dead letter now. It really only matters to the opposition party. So when the Democrats are in power, they didn't care about the Constitution. The Republicans, quote unquote, cared. Now it's switched. So the Democrats are, Trump, is all this stuff. We use the Constitution. Like it's all a charade. And I think that, for facade, it's all just the smoke and mirrors. I think we're definitely going to be headed to bigger and bigger government interventions. Probably going to get some sort of bailout for student loans, some sort of form of nationalist health care, et cetera. And while obviously you can't say, oh, the Federalists intended for this, like there wasn't a meeting at the Constitution Convention where they go like, all right, so we got to talk about single payer right now. They're obviously not saying that. But it was all basically implied from this government that had vague and unlimited power, at least the potential to create that. So I think that's where we're going. I think economic conditions are better than where they should be, simply because you have a lot of people saving right now, particularly newly retired baby boomers. That's been pushing the savings rate up. But as the decade goes on, and who knows what will happen in the near-term future, those savings will decline, and then we're going to be going through a lot of difficulties by the end of the decade and the early part of the next decade. But anyway, that's at least my 2 cents.
What would you say is something that we can try to do to thwart any of this eventuality as you're describing?
Well, that's a good question, because I know Rothbard mentioned about talked about this in some sort of popular commentaries, and he always was critical of the sort of the people akin to like the Atlas Shrugged, or what was it, like a Gulch, like where you just leave and you flee and you wait for the apocalypse and everything. And Rothbard said, one, your life chances are will be much higher standard of living in the economy than outside of it. But the main thing is to just try and spread the message, because even if you only postpone it, well, then you buy yourself a couple of years, so that's nice. I think the main thing is to just keep on trying to get the message out, talking to people, spreading the word. I think there's always better ways of communicating information to people, etc. And really just to try and do what you can, I guess, where, at the end of the day, I'm able to read and write about economics. It could be worse, and I love talking about it with people. So,
Very good. Charles, I see you've got your hand up.
Thanks. The history of economic thought, Professor Newman, have you explored those that big 2 volumes, right? Very much. And what do you think about it? There's some great history there. And what do you think he would write in his 3rd volume if he were able to do it?
Well, yeah, so that's a good question. I've read those 2 volumes. I've actually looked at sort of the process behind, the research grant for that and all the stuff. Rothbard wrote those in the he wrote those in the 80s, and he basically got done with the 2 volumes in 1993. He was supposed to work on the 3rd volume. He started to get a little sick, and then he died, and that's where that ended. I like those volumes a lot. I think that they're great histories. He goes through a lot of different perspectives. I think I know sometimes the criticism, he could be unfair with some people, particularly Adam Smith. I actually think he makes a lot of good points about Adam Smith. That's just my point, though. I think someone like Smith is still very important to read. I think they're great histories, especially because one volume, most historians' history of economic thought, they just start with Adam Smith. And Rothbard literally spends an entire volume before Adam Smith. I think that's a very important thing. Rothbard, in the third volume, he wanted to basically cover the Austrian school. So he wanted to go from 1871, the Martial Revolution, onwards, probably to about World War II. And it's unfortunate because that was probably the volume everyone wanted to read the most, or at least that's what the old saying goes. That's, he would have discussed, he would have gone through Keynes, he would have gone through Mises and Hayek, etc. And unfortunately, he never got to it. And I've been asked this a million times. If I had a dime for every time I was asked the question would be, well, is there any of his third volume actually done? Unfortunately not. So unlike the Progressive Era or his Conceived in Liberty, he appears to have never started it. To the extent that he did, it was just a couple notes for some lectures he gave here and there, but no serious groundwork, so to speak. So we really don't have, you have a broad idea of obviously what he would say, but you don't have anything concrete like you do with, say, the Progressive Era or Conceived in Liberty.
Jeff, unless someone else has their hand up, and anyone, there is a raise your hand symbol there, so just click that if you want to ask a question. What about you, Patrick? What's next for you? You're professing in college. You can't find that lost third volume, but boy, are you right. I don't know about you. Those two volumes of economic history, you're right. Going before Smith. Those French people he talks about, Cantillon and Turgot, all the way back to Aristotle. It's an amazing body of work. What about you personally? What's next for you project-wise? Anything Rothbardian or something else?
Yeah, so I'm actually working on my. I thought you never asked. No, I'm working on my own American history book. So it's actually called Liberty versus Power, and it's kind of a history of crony capitalism. I was asked to write this, and it's sort of been transforming, much like Rothbard's work, where at least I have a book done, so to speak, sort of continuing the story of the Conceived in Liberty series, going through the Federalist era in the Republican era. So it really goes through, it kind of covers some of the original material in Conceived in Liberty, but it really goes from about 1789 to about 1817. I'm currently working on the Jacksonian era. So that's my sort of project I'm working on. I'm obviously doing some stuff at the Mises Institute. We're trying to set up a graduate program there, as well as some own papers. But I was actually working on it today before gave this presentation. That's my talk, and I'm actually sort of tying in a lot of Rothbard's work and even the history of economic thought, showing how the founding fathers were influenced by particular economic thinkers and so on and all of that. And I like it. I think it'll be a great book, but I'll have to see. My dad says I should get an endorsement from Vicks, the people who make NyQuil. But anyway, I guess that's just his opinion. But yeah, that's what I'm working on, my own American history book. I'm about 400 pages in. So
what's interesting, though, as you're talking about, this eventuality potentially of the socialism and so on, but yet all these different liberal organizations seem to be flourishing like never in the past. So it sort of seems to fly in the face of that a little bit, especially globally too.
Yeah, you definitely see more of that. I think the spread of social media and the internet has facilitated that, I guess, in terms of the aggregate numbers. While libertarianism is certainly, I guess, bigger, how are we doing relative to everyone else? Where I see, and I talk with students, and I see one students today, to speak confidentially, are just bad. They don't read. They're constantly on their technology. I think it's just a giant legacy of the No Child Left Behind and all the education stuff in the Bush and Obama years. But more and more millennials and young people see socialism as like a viable alternative. The problems of the Cold War and all of that stuff, that's just more and more in the background, where I was born in the early 90s in 1991, so I don't remember any of the Cold War. Your average college student now was born in, starting freshman, didn't live a day in the 90s. So all of that stuff is sort of distant, and they only know the financial crisis, and they think that, okay, the government, it's capitalism's fault, the government's here to help, etc. So I think it's definitely promising. You see more libertarian organizations, etc. But at the same time, there is definitely the rising tide of socialist thinking among young people. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future. But yeah, it's a good point you bring up.
That was very good. We certainly appreciate you being here today in that regard, and definitely want to follow up in the future and also get a chance to see a little bit more about this stuff that you're up to. I did have a chance to find that article we were talking about for a minute there that's up on Lou Rockwell today, in fact. So I haven't read it but I happened to catch that headline this morning before I came over to the doctor's today.
Oh, I'll have to read this. I haven't seen this.
This could be a good one. So there you go. All right, excellent.
What's the title, Jeff?
It's called "What Would Murray Say About the Coronavirus?"
Oh my goodness.
So it's a very clever little thing here. It says he died 95, but what would he say about this today? So this would be a very interesting article for sure.
Okay.
So again, Patrick, thanks again, and please stay in touch with us.
Of course, and thank you so much for inviting me. And